In my previous talk titled Ending Destructive Moral Confusion, I brought up the greatest commandments of Jesus again and explained how they really are the most on point, practical, and perfect uh, moral instruction, ethical instruction that is available to us. And just as he said it was the perfect moral law, it turns out, if you pay close attention, that that's true. So the other side of the greatest commandments, which again is a teaching on comprehensive love, he's saying to love God, love others, and love yourself. So the opposite of love is abuse, so it's simultaneously a teaching against abuse. You can't love and abuse someone simultaneously. They're complete opposites. So with that as the foundation, I'm going to talk about the issue of being confrontational or non-confrontational. And this is a more difficult subject. It takes more careful thinking. And it's something that I've struggled with myself for a long time, um, sorting out the details of. But as they say, the devil is in the details, so we need to get into those details in order to sort out what really makes sense, what's really true, and what's really good. So being non-confrontational is more difficult of an issue. The question of whether we should be non-confrontational or not is more difficult than knowing whether we should be abusive in more obvious ways, right? Because the question of being non-confrontational or not actually does end up coming down to a question of love and abuse. It comes down to, is this violating the greatest commandments or not? In other words, if the perfect moral law is the greatest commandments of Jesus, to love God, others, and yourself, then the question is, okay, is being non-confrontational in alignment with that or not in alignment with that? So that's what I'm going to discuss in this talk. But before I do that, I wanted to, put this in context as far as the difficulty level again, because I've talked a lot about how an easy way to know whether something is abusive or not is to ask yourself if you could just do it to your neighbor or if your neighbor could do it to you. And if you use that method, you can cut through all the logical fallacies and propaganda that you're inundated with that is telling you that there's a special group of people called authority or called experts that have the special right to abuse, and so they can do things that you can't do yourself, and it's okay when they do it. And so this takes a little time to snap out of this false morality. I find that I've had a much much easier time recognizing this false morality just by not watching the news. The media is so powerful in the way it's manipulative to people's minds, that common sense can go by the wayside if you're constantly allowing that toxic propaganda to influence your worldview and your moral view. So I find that when to to me, pointing out something extremely obvious like, well, I can't force my neighbor to take any kind of medical treatment, or I can't force my neighbor to wear any particular medical device, or I can't coerce my neighbor into taking some pharmaceutical cocktail injection. So therefore, no one has the right to do that to me. Like, to me, that's just obvious, but I understand that's it's actually a difficult concept if you've been just listening to the media and following the narrative that they're pushing, which tries to convince you that it's actually legitimate, that these experts know best and they're just doing this in your own interest, and just trust them and never mind that it's technically abusive, just ignore that factor and just focus on the numbers of people supposedly ill, and focus on what's the latest news about the vaccine, or the latest news about masks, or focus on medical efficacy and never mind the abuse factor, which would be the number one thing on your mind if it was on a person to person, neighbor to neighbor level, right? It wouldn't matter how good of a medicine your neighbor was trying to force on you and your family. You would say, you can recommend this to me, but you have no right to force it on me, right? The medical efficacy is actually irrelevant to the issue of it being abusive or not. Telling my neighbor, oh, you can't travel outside this town unless you get a particular injection that I come up with, and I'm going to give you a passport. No, that would be rejected. That people would say, who do you think you are, right? Who do you think you are to do something like that? You can't just treat people like livestock, right? So most people have that common sense morality. If it's just a so-called regular person who's trying to push the abuse, but they then think there's an exception if the person pushing the abuse is a politician or a so-called scientific expert. They then think there's an exception to the rule against abuse because they've been deceived into basically becoming an idol worshiper. Basically, they've been deceived into Stockholm syndrome. So I say this at the start because this is, to me, a much easier level of understanding as far as morality goes. And yet, many people are not there yet. I think, again, largely due to their mass media consumption. So, what I'm going to be talking about here concerning confrontation and whether it's good to be non-confrontational or not, the issue of whether to be non-confrontational or not is difficult because the deception of this issue, like the way that it's framed by mainstream culture, and just by our own thinking that is influenced by false, irrational, and unkind thoughts, it can seem reasonable. So it can seem that being non-confrontational makes your life easier, right? It's like if someone just does something aggressive to you in a minor way, it can seem like, well, if I just ignore it, if I just, don't even confront them about it, that you've kept you've kept it from escalating, right? Like, it's like, yeah, what they did wasn't cool, but if I confront them about it, it's just going to make it worse, right? So that's kind of the basic thought process that I think many people, and I know, including, of course, myself, have had many times when confronted with something that we know isn't right, but it's a minor form of abuse. So the thought is, well, it's better just to bite my tongue. It's better just to take the so-called high road here and not get upset about this, right? Other thoughts that might come to mind is like, well, this person isn't going to change anyway. Even if I say something, what's the point? They're not even going to listen, right? So all these kind of rationalizations often come up in our minds, right? Telling us why it's better just to let it slide, it's better just to not even say anything or do anything. And again, the difficulty here is that it's kind of, you're dealing with half truths, right? Because the desire to not make something worse is a good desire, right? And so the motivation or the intention is sound. It's like, well, this is kind of bad, but I don't want things to get even worse. So I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to be confrontational. So the intention is good. The question is whether that action or that non-action is actually supporting that intention or not. And that's getting into the devil in the details there. Another part of it that's like a half-truth that can support us in being non-confrontational is that we don't want to be overreactive, right? A common label, is a drama queen. So this is talking about someone who gets upset over just about anything, meaning they get upset about things that aren't really bad, right? And so we don't want to be that person either, hopefully, right? We don't want to be someone that's making a fuss over things that really aren't a problem. And you may be guilty of this yourself, or you may have observed it, yourself in just everyday life, maybe in some kind of customer service situation where you see someone get upset with a waiter or waitress, and the waiter or waitress didn't actually do anything bad, but the person is making a fuss over nothing, basically. So you don't want to be that, right? So another good intention that can support being non-confrontational is, well, I don't want to be a drama queen. I don't want to get upset over things that aren't really bad, right? So the combination of that, plus not wanting to make things worse, I think those two intentions, coupled with the belief that being non-confrontational is in alignment with those intentions, it goes hand in hand in a way to restrain us or, convince us that being non-confrontational is the better way to go. So I wanted to relate this to what I think is in the same category. I think this is what Jesus was talking about when he said to take up your cross and follow me. That phrase oftentimes is kind of overlooked, or maybe it's because it's a bit mysterious, we might just pass by it because we're not really sure what he meant by that, right? It's pretty clear, it's pretty common sense, I think, to say that he's not saying to literally, seek out being crucified as he was, with a literal wooden cross. Especially when you read in some of these verses when it says to take up your cross daily. So obviously you can't be crucified more than once in a single lifetime. So obviously there's some symbolism going on here. There's some metaphor. And what I propose is that take up your cross is basically saying to face the confrontations that come your way in your daily life. And before I go any further, I'm going to just read you the relevant passages, and I'll read from different versions of the Bible so that you can hear, different translations, but all talking about this idea of taking up your cross. So in Mark 8:34, in the Aramaic Bible in plain English translation, we have, quote, "And Yeshua called the crowds with his disciples, and he said to them, 'Whoever is willing to come after me, let him renounce himself and take up his cross, and let him come after me.'" So I'll read a few others here. Matthew 10:38, this is from the Contemporary English Version, quote, "And unless you are willing to take up your cross and follow me, you are not fit to be my disciples," end quote. Again, Matthew 10:38, this is from the Good News translation. Those who do not take up their cross and follow in my steps are not fit to be my disciples, end quote. This is Matthew 16:24, the God's Word translation. Quote, then Jesus said to his disciples, those who want to come with me must say no to the things that they want, pick up their crosses, and follow me, end quote. And finally, from Luke 9:23, this is the New Living Translation. Quote, then he said to the crowd, if any of you want to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross daily, and follow me, end quote. So the question is, what does this mean to take up your cross? Again, this is something we can do daily, and it also involves being a disciple of Jesus, and it also involves following him. So one thing that I think it's fair to say about Jesus is that he confronted the mainstream institutions of his day and rejected them. So he was a confrontational figure, to say the least. He was pointing people in the right direction and pointing out how they were incorrect in their views and in their practices, right? He went into the temple and he freed all the animals that were going to be murdered as a religious practice, and turned over the tables of the men that were selling those animals for the sacrifice, right? He rejected that blood sacrifice ritual as being not what God actually wants, not being a legitimate religious practice. And he pointed people to the right way to go, which is the greatest commandments. So on multiple occasions, you can read about him being confrontational, calling people hypocrites more than once. So I would argue that take up your cross is actually another way of saying be confrontational. But be confrontational in the way that he was. So since he said that the perfect moral law is a comprehensive love, this confrontation can't be abusive, right? So that rules out being confrontational in an irrational way or in an angry way or an aggressive way, right? It would be confrontational in alignment with truth, in alignment with love, in alignment with rationality, right? So that would rule out the drama queen. That would rule out, being overreactive. He's certainly not advising us to be confrontational against things that aren't actually bad, right? And he's not advising us to be excessive with our confrontation, where to the point where we are abusive about it. So this fits in with, also mainstream culture, wherein countless stories and movies and, myths that talk about heroism always include the hero being willing to confront evil, right? Or the willingness to be confrontational. A hero is called to action, right? We don't associate heroism with passivity, right? So just another thought to keep in mind here as far as why being confrontational might actually be logical. Another reason is that you actually condone evil when you don't reject it, even when it's at a subtle level. And something that I think most people would agree has occurred on many occasions is that For example, with a bully at school among children, if the bully does some minor aggressive act, say he nudges another boy and nothing is done, the boy just kind of cowers back and doesn't reject it at all, that bully is likely to repeat that abuse, right? And in fact, that bully is even likely to escalate that, right? The next time he might shove that boy, and then the time after that, he might punch the boy, right? You give them an inch, they'll take a mile is a well-known saying because it has truth to it. That is something that does happen sometimes, for sure, is if you let someone get away with minor infraction, they will often escalate it to a greater extent, right? That's just a fact of life. So I'm going to go on a slight tangent here, but it's related. So in Revelation 3, chapter 3 of Revelation, verse 15, reads as the following. I know your works. You are neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were either cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. And then this continues. Be earnest, therefore, and repent. Listen, I am standing at the door knocking. If you hear my voice and open the door, I will come in to you and eat with you, and you with me. To the one who conquers, I will give a place with me on my throne, just as I myself conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. So that's Jesus speaking there. And what I wanted to highlight in particular with that passage is him talking about not being lukewarm, being either hot or cold. And then also that being in the context of being a conqueror, right? So if you're just lukewarm about things, right? You don't really get hot or cold about anything. That's a very passive kind of way of being, right? Opposite of that would be a conqueror, right? You wouldn't call a conqueror a passive person, right? So we have Jesus there and elsewhere talking about the importance of being a conqueror. So this, to me, supports, again, the idea that taking up your cross is actually speaking about being confrontational. I was listening to a couples therapist talk, and he was saying that the number one fundamental problem that he observed was the man and woman failing to be confrontational at whatsoever. So the reason for most of the difficulties in the relationships that he encountered was that they never actually would confront each other on things that were bothering them, right? And so it ended up causing more trouble overall than if they had just calmly confronted one another and spoken their truth. So whether you're looking at this from a religious context or a secular, just philosophical, psychological, sociological kind of perspective, I think it's a really important issue, right? But again, it can seem that it's better to not be confrontational when the offense is minor. So the first thing that needs to be sorted out in your mind is what is an actual offense and what isn't, right? Because again, you don't want to be getting confrontational about things that you shouldn't be confrontational about, right? You don't want to be complaining about things that aren't really a problem, you know? You don't want to just be this like high-strung, hair-trigger person that's just, losing their cool or, you know, um, telling people they've done bad things on a regular basis when they haven't actually done anything bad, right? So you have to see that as, yes, that's something to avoid. But you have to also be rational and recognize that you could be falling into the either or fallacy where you're thinking that it's either being this overreactive person that rejects things that aren't even really bad, or being this completely passive person that doesn't reject anything at all, right? That's a false dichotomy. There is a middle way which does reject evil that is actually evil, and that rejection is done in an ethical, rational, calm way, right? So there is actually a way to take up your cross, so to speak, to be confrontational that would actually be productive, right? But again, thoughts are going to come up that are going to try and convince you that this isn't true. For example, oh well, people don't change, right? But something I've observed in my own life and I've seen happen with other people is that if someone actually did confront another person about an actual wrong, they weren't being overreactive. One person really did wrong the other person, and then that person that was wrong responded in a calm but assertive way and pointed out very specifically what was wrong about what happened. That actually can lead to resolution. That actually is a scenario in which change can happen. Unlike if you lose your cool and just, get angry at the person or, just return evil for evil and get abusive back to them, that generally speaking, or I would say never results in progress, right? But there is a way to be confrontational that does actually have great potential for progress. And again, going back to the bullying analogy, this is something that is rational to take part in, because if you don't reject abuse, it's likely to repeat. And this could be because the person is really under, you could say, like heavy demonic influence where they're just driven to abuse. Or it could be because they don't even really realize what they're doing is abusive because no one ever really pointed it out to them, right? It never was made clear to them. And so once it is made clear, they kind of snap out of that bad thinking and bad behavior and discontinue it, right? That is a possibility. So if you have a depressed thought coming up in a moment that calls you to be confrontational, that says, oh, well, don't bother. There's no point. No one's going to change. He or she isn't going to change. Don't let that dissuade you from making the attempt, because it can actually be productive. Again, going back to the children in the school, a good teacher might go to the person who was doing the bullying and saying, hey, what you were doing was aggressive. It was abusive, and it's not loving to do that. It's not something that's acceptable. We shouldn't be abusive towards each other. You wouldn't like it if someone was abusive towards you. So maybe you didn't realize that what you were doing was harming that other person, but it is. So, please don't ever do that again. And I think a lot of children, if confronted that way, might say, oh, okay. They might even apologize. So whether a child or an adult, it is possible that it can actually end the pattern, right? If you don't reject abuse, it's likely to repeat. But if you do reject it in a correct manner, it's likely to end the pattern of abuse. So the idea that it's easier to be non-confrontational is short-sighted, right? It can seem easier maybe at that moment because you're not doing anything, you're just being silent, right? It takes some effort to speak to someone and tell them what you're thinking, and tell them what they did was wrong. And you may have to face some backlash from them. They might get defensive and try and shame you. But that's actually worth the effort if it results in ending the pattern, right? So you have to be a little confrontational at that moment, but then you may have just ensured that it's not ever going to continue indefinitely into the future, right? If you did nothing, it can seem like that's easier, but you've actually just made your life harder, or you've made the life harder of whoever was being abused that you observed, right? So that's one reason why being confrontational in a rational, calm way makes sense. I know that's repetitive to say it's rational, it makes sense, but the point here being that it can seem correct to be non-confrontational because you don't see the effect immediately. It can seem that doing nothing resulted in less problems because you didn't have to add to the so-called problem of the conflict on top of the subtle evil that took place. But the flawed thought there is that the conflict is a problem, right? So we might be thinking, well, I don't want to make matters worse, right? And so you think, well, the conflict is another problem on top of the problem of whatever they did. So it's just better to let it go. And I totally get that train of thought, because that's the train of thought that my mind has followed countless times. It's very tempting to follow that train of thought. It seems somewhat reasonable. You have to be really careful and be more intelligent. We need to use a little more critical thinking to realize that what we're doing, our behavior isn't actually based on pure rationality, and it's not actually beneficial. So the idea that the conflict is a problem being added on to the problem of whatever abuse it is that we observed is flawed, because the conflict isn't actually a problem. That's the key insight, is recognizing that by taking up your cross, by being confrontational in the correct way, you're actually carrying out the solution to the problem. You're not adding one problem to another. So a parallel to this would be like someone who's been kind of handicapped by a fear of rejection. They're afraid, well, I may like this person, but they're really worried about the person not liking them back, or, saying, no, thanks, I'm not interested in, spending time with you, right? And so the flaw in the thinking there by the person with the fear of rejection is that's a loss. Because if you're being your authentic self and a person isn't compatible with that, then you haven't actually lost anything, right? Because to spend time with someone that doesn't like your authentic self can't possibly be a pleasant experience, right? For whatever reason, if they're just not compatible with you because of differences in worldview or personality, or just differences in, life situation, maybe just things that they have going on in their life that don't fit, maybe they're preoccupied with other relationships or career or whatever, they're just not compatible with you, that's not actually a loss, right? So you're fearing rejection because you're thinking of the rejection as a loss, when actually you could look at it as a gain, because you've just gained clarity about someone who before you didn't know whether it was compatible with you or not, and now you know. So you've gained insight. That's not actually a loss. So returning again, though, to the issue of, confrontation concerning something that's actually abusive. To clarify again, so that we're not overreacting, I find that there's only three things that are truly evil and that should always be rejected because they are just purely bad, have no good effect whatsoever in the world. And these are actually just three forms of abuse. So that's why the non-abuse principle is key. And again, the non-abuse principle is just another way of saying the greatest commandments of Jesus, right? Because he commanded comprehensive love. Abuse is the opposite of love. So to command love is also to command non-abuse. So the three forms of abuse are aggression, defined as the initiation of violence, deception, which includes cheating someone of their money, time, or anything that they deserve. And one detail on this that became more clear to me recently is, say, and it fits into this context, because say you are being confrontational in a good way. Say someone really did something abusive, say in a deceptive way. Say they knowingly cheated you of $20, right? And you found out and you confront them about them. You confront them about this. And they apologize. They say, "I'm sorry," or "I apologize." But then they add on some kind of excuse. They add on, well, times have been rough and, this and that or whatever. They just add some kind of excuse where they maybe even try and make it like you complaining about the theft is kind of bad on your part. Like, yeah, you shouldn't have even really be complaining about this. It's no big deal, right? They might even try and turn it on, make you out to be the bad guy in some way, make you out to be at fault. And so it's not a true apology. So they've cheated you of something that you were owed, which was the true apology, by giving a fake apology, by saying, "I'm sorry," but then adding on these kind of backhanded excuses, right? And this correlates with Hebrews 12:2. So in Hebrews 12:2, we read that, well, let me actually pull it up here so that I can quote exactly. This is a really important scripture. It correlates with all of the previous ones that I've read concerning taking up your cross. So here in 12:2, we read, looking to Jesus as the pioneer and perfecter of faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and then he's taken the seat at the right hand of the throne of God. So one thing, though, that I think is important to recognize here is that when it says disregarding its shame, it's important to recognize that that doesn't mean that what he did was actually shameful, right? What he did was incredibly compassionate. He was willing to sacrifice his own life, sacrifice his body to expose the evil of human authority. Right? Some people look at the crucifixion along with chapter 5 in Matthew to it seems that Jesus is promoting pacifism. It seems like he's saying, if someone is abusing you, just take the abuse, and that you actually can have this transformative power by just taking the abuse and not resisting whatsoever. So, before I discuss chapter 5 of Matthew with the famous mistranslation of turn the other cheek, let me finish what I was going to say here about Hebrews 12, 12:2. So we have enduring the cross, right? So there's some effort involved, right? If we're going to take up our cross, we're going to be enduring something. And what I believe it is that we have to endure is this shame, but it's not a shame based on having actually done something wrong. It'd be better to translate this as disregarding, or sometimes it's translated as ignoring the shaming. Right? If you read about the experience of Jesus after he was, wrongly sentenced to be crucified, he was shamed the whole way. He was shamed when they were deliberating, when the Roman, when Pontius Pilate was deliberating, whether to crucify him or not, there was the crowd, shaming him, yelling, all these bad things about Jesus, making him out to be the bad guy, right? So I believe this is very symbolic and very true to life, as far as what happens when you take up your cross, when you're confrontational in your daily life, right? When you actually reject subtle acts of evil, you're likely to be shamed for doing so. The people, because it's a small act especially, people think that they can get away with it, and oftentimes the way that they attempt to do so is by shaming the person that called them out, right? They get defensive and they'll just shame the person and say, oh, they might even say, oh, you're being a drama queen, or, oh, give me a break. That doesn't matter. Or, oh, they'll just turn against you in one way or another. Or they'll say, oh, what about the time that you did this? And one logical fallacy after another, rather than just accepting the fact that what they did was wrong. That is a possibility. They might try and shame you. And that is something difficult to face if you don't have, you could say, a strong backbone, if you don't have also strong faith that what you're doing is for the greater good overall. Right? Jesus knew what he was doing was for the greater good overall by exposing this evil. And like the verse says, because of the joy he knew that was set before him. So the key is recognizing that even though you have to endure the shame of the confrontation, the false shame, the shaming, if you recognize that it is actually for the best, and that you will actually gain satisfaction and honor for doing so, then you can endure the cross. Right? Then you can follow Jesus, because you are following the true morality and the true authority, right? Which corresponds with the final portion of Hebrews 12:2 here. It says, he then took his seat, or he rested at the right hand of the throne of God, right? And the throne of God is his throne of authority, right? True authority, true morality. So you've conquered the false social morality, and you now rest with satisfaction in alignment with God's true morality. So most Christians will think of Matthew 5:39 through 5:42 as examples of Jesus saying that it's best to be non-confrontational. And what I found is that this is due to a mistranslation. So Matthew 5:39 in most Bibles reads, I'll start with 5:38 for the context. So Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." And then verse 39 in the common mistranslation reads, "But I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also." So the way that that's translated, it sounds like Jesus is saying, forget about this eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth thing. I'm giving you a new teaching. And if you're very familiar with his teaching throughout the New Testament, you'll recognize that that's contradictory already, because he said that he didn't come to change or replace the law, but to fulfill it. So that should be a red flag right off the bat. But secondly, if we're to take this common translation seriously, it's saying that if someone starts hitting you, just offer up the other side of your face to be hit as well, right? It's like accepting being a human punching bag. And the interesting thing is, I did a little research to see what other Christians were saying about this verse, and unsurprisingly, they gave very weak explanations. They basically just rationalized away and went off on tangents, trying to make sense of this verse. They basically said, don't take it literally, but they didn't really give you any reason why not to. And I'll give the reason why not to here, and that being that it's a mistranslation. But again, abuse is the opposite of love. So it's another contradiction, because how could Jesus be telling us to love ourselves, right? That's part of the greatest commandments, but to also accept abuse, right? That's a contradiction. It doesn't make sense. And if you look into the Greek of Matthew 5:39, you find that there's another way to translate those words, and the meaning is the complete opposite. So I found this with the study of the Tao Te Ching as well, that you can have a grouping of words where there's multiple translations for each word, and it's possible to make two different sentences, even completely opposing in meaning. But if you choose, each word, say, has 5 different possible definitions, right? When you look in the dictionary, some words have multiple possibilities that are very different from one another as far as what the meaning of the word is. So likewise with the Greek. And so it's possible that you could just choose, say, 5 words that when put together form a coherent sentence, but it's not the correct translation, right? It was actually a different combination of 5 words that formed a different coherent sentence that was the correct translation. So in Matthew 5:39, the first word right off the bat, but, can also be translated as on top of this, or moreover, or indeed now. So instead of this but meaning, well, as a contradiction, it can actually mean moreover, like in alignment with what was just said. So eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, moreover. So he's not contradicting that. He's amplifying it, or he's adding to that idea. He's taking that idea further, right? Moreover. Then the next word, to not resist the evil person. The word not in the original Greek can be translated to surely. And it pointed out that in the Greek concordance that this translation to surely was actually done multiple times throughout the Bible. I think it was 4 times. So it's not just like a one-off possibility. It's a legitimate translation of the word. So instead of don't resist, it's moreover, surely resist the evil person. And then it continues, indeed, whoever strikes you on the right jaw. So cheek is a translation of jawbone or jaw. Return to him. So in the Bible, you'll read turn, but if you look at that word turn in Greek, it's actually return. A legitimate translation of there is actually, I would say, just a more accurate translation of that word is return. And so instead of turn to him also, it's return to him likewise. So this word also can be translated as likewise. So it's return to him likewise. And then instead of the other, they said a literal translation of what they translated just simply as the is, quote, what had happened, end quote. That's a literal translation of the Greek. And the word other is actually another, this Greek word allos, A-L-L-O-S. And then they even specified what kind of another it is. And they said it's technically another of the same kind or another of similar type. So altogether we read, moreover, surely resist the evil person. Indeed, whoever strikes you on the right jaw, return to him likewise what had happened, another of the same kind, end quote. So here Jesus is actually saying, if someone punches you in the jaw, return likewise, right? And this is in the context of what he was saying previously with the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. So he was saying, not only on that more gross level, right? Because you would say, an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth is a more severe form of violence and retribution, right? More damaging to the body than just a punch on the jaw. But he's saying, even a punch on the jaw you should reject. Even that you should return another of the same kind. So he's saying, be confrontational. Don't accept abuse. In the next verse, Matthew 5:40, the way that most Christians read it, again, they take it as him being pro-abuse and anti-confrontational. So the verse normally reads in this mistranslation as, if anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. So if you look up the word sue, it can also be translated as try, as in try out. And let him can also be translated as permit. So the correct translation is, if someone wishes to try out your tunic or your shirt, permit him to use your cloak or your jacket as well. And so here he's talking about being generous to someone that asks something reasonable of you. And this should sound familiar because if you're a normal, decent person, you've probably done something like this before. Or maybe someone has done it for you, where someone asks you for a small favor and you recognize, well, it's a legitimate request. If someone's asking for a shirt, it's probably because they're not even wearing a shirt and maybe it's cold out, right? So, I've had this experience myself where like you're working working at a farm and someone thought it was going to be a really hot day, and so they didn't bring a shirt, but then it turns out to be chillier than expected, and they're like, "Oh man, I um, should have brought a shirt today. Do you happen to have an extra one?" And you say, "Yeah, I do. No problem. Let me go grab it. And you know what? Here's this extra light jacket too, right?" So you repay them even more than they requested. But you're not doing it because they sued you in court, right? They're trying to make it sound as if someone is doing this abusive thing where they're just trying to like steal your clothing, right? That's totally incorrect view. Again, common sense, because that's saying accept abuse, and Jesus taught us to love ourselves, to love others. It's the opposite of abuse. So what he's actually teaching, which makes sense, fits his main teaching on what the moral law is, and just fits our own common sense where it's not good to accept abuse. He's not saying, if someone just demands your property just to be, just because they want it, that you should just give it all to them. Someone's like, "Oh, I want your clothing, I want your car, I want I want your house, I want to, this and that." And you're just like, "Okay, sure, here you go, here you go, here you go." No, because that's accepting abuse, right? So just that one word, changing try to sue, they made it out to be pro-abuse. Just how they changed the words in Matthew 5:39 to make it sound like it's pro-abuse when it's actually anti-abuse. So the next line in Matthew 5 that is often referred to and supposedly, shows Jesus being pro-abuse and ultra-pacifism, is Matthew 5:41. "And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2." So this again is often translated by the church, by the Pauline church, to mean that if someone demands you go with them 1 mile, you should go with them 2. And I've heard people rationalize this too as like, oh, he was advocating a creative nonviolent resistance where, because the Roman law was that you could only go 1 mile, that if you make them go 2, then you got them into trouble. No. I mean, this is really naive, first of all, to think that the Roman Empire was so diligent about whatever these so-called, rules were, that they would, hold back on their abuse of the people they were conquering and enslaving. Oh, because, we've gone 1.2 miles. Oh, I'm very sorry, young sir. Here's a gold coin for my my violation. No. Being compelled to do something doesn't mean you're demanded, right? Someone can give you a compelling reason to help them. You might hear of a charity that has a very compelling story, right? And maybe they're asking for a very reasonable, low donation. Maybe you find the charity is compelling and they ask for $5. And you say, "You know what? I'll give you double that. Here's 10, right?" And I've had this experience myself. I remember doing a fundraiser many years back at the university. We were raising money for Iraqi school children whose schools had been destroyed. And this guy came and we asked, just for like a small donation, told him what it was about and said, I forget what we asked him for, but maybe it was something like $5 or $10 if he could afford it. And he just walked away. And I foolishly made the assumption that, he just thought it was a bad charity or whatever. He just wasn't interested in donating anything. Anyway, a couple minutes later, he came back with like stacks and like hundreds of dollars. So he had just gone to the bank and came back, and so that's an example of someone saying, you know what, I'll not only go with you 1 mile, I'll go with you two, right? Because you find the request compelling, right? Compelling doesn't, you don't have to read that as demand, but that's how most Christian pastors are going to tell you it. That's how they're going to translate it to you, is, oh, they were being forced. No. And this is verified again in the context right there. If you just pay attention to Jesus, then more than you pay attention to these Pauline pastors, the very next verse, Jesus says, "Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away." Right? So this is exactly in line with what I was just saying. If someone asks you for your shirt and you could tell they really needed it, well, give it to them. And not only that, give them, if you have an extra jacket or sweatshirt, give them that too. Be generous. And if someone wants to borrow from you, again, that's try. Can I try your shirt or your cloak? Don't turn them away. He's just saying be generous. Be very generous, right? Because that's being loving, which is the opposite of abuse. So again, they've turned his ministry backwards, where they're trying to make him out to be pro-abuse when he was completely against abuse. Again, he was for comprehensive love. So, in conclusion, being non-confrontational is actually being pro-abuse. And abuse makes your life worse, it makes the world worse. So if you're able to identify abuse rightly, it's best to reject it. And another reason why this is rational is because when the abuse is in a small form, it's still manageable. You can actually change things for you. You can actually have a transformative power, right? And this is the transformative power actually provided by God, by his grace. Right? It's not just us, it's not just in our power that we're able to do this, but it's the scenario itself. And this is a deeper metaphysical level of what take up your cross means, but a wooden cross has 12 sides, and there's actually 12 kairos moments, which are these subtle and sudden 1-second moments of opportunity to improve your life by either rejecting an evil or embracing a desire, rejecting an evil directed at yourself or others, or embracing a desire for yourself or for others. But in that moment, you need to be confrontational, not only against any injustice or evil that you're observing, but against the fear, anger, depression, sloth, craving, mischievousness, or conceitedness that arises in your mind that's trying to convince you to be lukewarm and to cower rather than take up your cross and be a conqueror in alignment with Jesus' grace. So, for all of these reasons, the more rational thing to do is actually be confrontational. When it's a subtle act, you can conquer it. But if you let it get out of hand, like to the point of bombs dropping, to return to the real life scenario of, Iraqi school children and their schools being bombed, and that's something that's happened elsewhere many times and, continuing to this day, right? When abuse gets to such an extreme level like that, you can't actually do anything at that point, right? It's just 1 minute you're sitting in your home and the next minute you're dead, right? Because the abuse got so out of hand, right? The abusers were allowed to grow to such an extent in power that they could no longer be readily resisted, right? So that's, why the Second Amendment, for example, is so important in the United States, is because if you let a government disarm the population, well, then you've just increased their power, their ability to abuse even more, and you're not able to defend yourself against that. So if you accept these apparently minor jabs of gun control measures, it's like, oh, just a little more abuse here, a little more abuse there. But then before you know it, you're defenseless and you're under a tyrannical regime. So, various scenarios point us to the truth that it's actually rational and productive to focus on the subtle forms of abuse that we encounter, because those are actually the ones that we can conquer, and in doing so, prevent the abuse from repeating or escalating. So, multiple reasons. But this is easier said than done. Me saying this out loud is for my own benefit as well, because I need to affirm these truths, affirm this rationality still more in my own life in order for this to sink in, because the subconscious false beliefs that being confrontational is actually problematic rather than a solution, or to think that the shaming is justified, if they say you're being overreactive when you're not, and not wanting to face that and thinking it's better just to avoid that when, again, it's not. Getting into these details of the logic and the truth can then prepare you to carry out this higher level of morality. And again, Jesus said that unless our righteousness is exceedingly high, we will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. So this is the higher level. And again, if you're still stuck on the lower level, look into vegan nutrition. Leaving animals alone is definitely the right way. If, again, you've been taught by your church or whoever that it's legit, it's not. There's no nutrients in the flesh of an animal's body that you need to be healthy. If you think, oh, well, didn't Jesus eat fish? No. If you look into that, the vegetarian or vegan origins of the early Christians is there to be found in history, buried history. But again, don't follow excuses for abuse. If you don't need to harm anyone, don't harm them. Animals aren't plants. They're sentient creatures that feel pain, have emotions, want to live. And then on the human scale, if you can't force your neighbor to take medical devices and treatments, and you can't put them under curfew and travel restrictions, etc., well, then neither can nobody else. Neither can it. It's abuse. The abuse is evil under all circumstances. It doesn't become legitimate just because someone with a fancy title or uniform is doing the abusing. So again, that's like level 1 human decency, being against the abuse of animals and being against the abuse of humans on the large scale. And once you get that under your belt, with the news turned off, you can then focus on this more subtle level that takes a bit more careful thought to recognize that our point of power is actually in these subtle kairos moments that offer us salvation if we align with the greatest commandments of Jesus perfectly at those moments. In other words, unless we're perfectly loving and perfectly aligned with truth at those moments, we won't fulfill them. And so we won't gain the satisfaction or the lasting life, lasting satisfaction that are offered to us at those moments. I'll link to my essay on Kairos moments so that you can learn more about them if you're curious. But I hope you found that this talk on confrontation was valuable, and that you will no longer read those verses in Matthew 5 and think that they are correct and that Jesus was telling you to accept abuse. He most certainly was not. Again, he accepted the crucifixion not because he was pro-abuse. He accepted the crucifixion to expose the evil of human authority by showing that they would torture and crucify a divine person on the planet, perfectly innocent. He perfectly condemned human authority to turn us to the true authority, which is God. So he was doing that as an act of love against the abuse of human rulers by exposing their evil so that people could snap out of their Stockholm syndrome from thousands of years ago. But unfortunately, because of Pauline theology and the false apostle Paul's teaching on government being one and the same as God, and to obey the government is to obey God, because they've been deceived by that false apostle, by that antichrist, and by all these mistranslations, and by all the propaganda that they're inundated with every day, they're still, unfortunately, under the Stockholm syndrome, still accepting this abuse by a small group of people called authority, or called experts, and thinking that it's legitimate when it never was. When Jesus said it was the perfect law, he wasn't mistaken. There was no asterisk to that law. It was no exception saying love is always the right way and abuse is never the right way, except in an emergency, or except if the abusing is being done by a so-called authority. No, there's no exceptions. That's why the law is perfect as it is. If you just listened to what he said and followed it, you wouldn't get so easily deceived and corralled into this police state communist dystopia that they're spreading around the world right now in the year 2021. All right, thank you for listening.